Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei zui. Welcome to this NZI Te Reo Rua Education for All webinar on the Enabling Good Lives Principles in Education. As we wait for people to join us tonight, it would be great if you could put your name and where you are joining from in the chat section. And please make sure that you set your chat function to everyone being able to see the message instead of just the panelists. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available for people to watch at a later date through the Ngāo Aokaha website. And I'd very much like to welcome tonight and to thank our New Zealand Sign Language interpreter for this webinar, Fiona Love. Just going to give a little pause here while I just see other people joining the webinar, and then we'll move into a karakia. Okay, to start, I will begin with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ehi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he huhu, ti hei, mauri ora. Ko Māgi Askin Jarden toko wingoa, he tumua ki tuarua o te Kapuhu Rickerton School, ahau. So my name is Māgi. I'm a deputy principal at a school in Christchurch, Otatahi, and I'm also the mother to two autistic teenage sons. And as an NZI Te Reo Rua member, I am very honoured this evening to be hosting this webinar. And we're very fortunate to have a great panel joining us tonight. Shane McEnroe, joining from Otatahi, Christchurch, is on the national leadership team of Enabling Good Lives. Frian Wadia will be joining us from Auckland. She wears many hats and is a mum to three lovely boys, all with varying abilities. She's also an early intervention teacher. Julie Hook is joining us from Wellington, and she works for the Ministry of Education as the Chief Advisor for inclusive curriculum in the Curriculum and Early Learning Group, and is also working on the refresh of the New Zealand curriculum. And lastly, Sonia Reid is the head of Department of Special Needs at Awatapu College, which is a mainstream state school in Palmerston North. It's also great to be joined by so many participants this evening from across Aotearoa. And if you haven't done so already, it would be great if you could put your name, as mentioned previously, and where you're joining from in the chat and make it available for everyone to see rather than just the panelists. For NZI Te Reo Rua, this webinar is part of our Ngāo Aokaha All In for Tamariki campaign, which is a coalition campaign that brings together people across the community to ensure that all tamariki get the support they need to feel connected, supported and valued at their school or in their early childhood education centres. And you can join the campaign by heading to www.ngaoaokaha.org or following the link that you can find in the chat. So the purpose of the webinar this evening is to explore how the Enabling Good Lives, or EGL, approach, particularly the principles and the vision of EGL, can be used to support disabled people and their whānau, especially within the context of education. Enabling Good Lives is a partnership between the disability sector and the government agencies that are aimed at long-term transformation of how disabled people and families are supported to live everyday lives. Enabling Good Lives is a values-supported approach based on the principles of self-determination, beginning early and being centred around the person. Enabling Good Lives is also a funding mechanism and is available to some disabled children who meet certain criteria in certain regions, namely within Christchurch, Mid-Central and Waikato. In the webinar today, whilst we may touch on some funding issues, we will be spending the majority of the time on the principles and the approach of EGL. Each of the panellists will begin by answering a specific question, each about a different aspect of the EGL approach, and then we will move into a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, my apologies, and if you'd like it answered by a specific person on the panel, please make that clear when you post the question. I invite the panellists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about their roles as they begin their session answering the question posed of them. Fiona, I've just got a little message here for you. If you are able to, please move a little closer to your camera. Apparently, it's just coming through as a little blurry. Right, Shane, we're going to come to you first tonight. Could you begin by talking about the inception of the Enabling Good Lives approach and the principles of EGL and what Enabling Good Lives does to support disabled people? Over to you.
What a big question to start with. You might have to break that down in bits for me. So,
Sure.
Do you mind reading that?
No, I don't mind at all. So if you'd like to just tell us a little bit more about yourself first.
Okay, yeah, sure. So, kia ora, I'm Shane McEnroe. I'm on the National Enabling Good Lives. I wear many other hats, part of People First. I wear many hats, but I don't work.
Well, I think you do work because I've already heard tonight that you have been instrumental on the Enabling Good Lives planning. So do you want to share a little bit about that and then we can go into the question?
Yes. I think it was 2016. I was part of the high level design. So that's now the baby of what the government calls mana whakaha. So the Palmerston North area and that got rolled out, I'm going to say 1st of October 2017. And then from there, as of anything, these have always been hinks and niggles. But those hinks and niggles seem to be getting smaller and smaller by the day. We'd like to hope.
I'm sure you've played an instrumental role in that, Shane. So can you talk a little bit about why Enabling Good Lives approach was thought of and worked on in the first instance?
Why was it thought of? Because disabled people in Whanau were sick of the deficit-based post of funding, and the Enabling Good Lives takes the whole count of funding and also not just focusing on money. I always say money is not the most important thing. You've got to think broader. So, and just got to think of how the family is living. So it also takes the account of the whānau approach as well. I think I went a little off track there.
No, that's perfect. So really, the principles are obviously central to this. And yes, it's the principles that allow people to think about what a good life would be if a disabled person was able to actually control that themselves. So do you want to talk a little bit about those principles, what are really important about enabling the disabled person themselves to have power in deciding things for their own lives?
The most important thing is the disabled person will be able to the power of their own sort of, they may not want to employ their own staff. There's agency can do that, but I know some people who want to employ their staff but don't want to do the fun stuff like KiwiSaver and all that sort of exciting stuff, but they still want to see the ins and outs. So, but there's some disabled people who don't want to see the ins and outs. They just find that very overwhelming. But there's some people who want to have control and want to pay their own staff and want to do that. But there's a range.
So it sounds like central to EGL is quite a high level of flexibility so that the disabled person themselves can determine the degree to which they want to be highly involved or have other people assisting.
Yes, and I always say the Enabling Good Lives may not be in your area right now, but the Enabling Good Lives approach is. So you can use those Enabling Good Lives principles, those 8 principles, and use it in your life right now. Beginning early, self-directed, mana enhancing. I won't go through all 8.
I believe there's going to be a link shared for all participants anyway to see the website that outlines those principles. Shane, to finish off then, would you like to talk about how EGL supports disabled people?
How EGL supports disabled people? Being able to make the disabled person really think for themselves. A lot of disabled people are sort of been in that sort of mindset of, this is my funding for this year, and being able to think broader. I know some people who have bought houses, some people have bought spa pools, and it was very controversial, but now the spa pools are now saving the disabled person money because they only may not need support. They may only need very little support now. So it's just a range of flexibility.
Great. Thank you very much, Shane. That's a really good start for this webinar this evening. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to you later with some further questions. Thanks for now. Julie, we're coming to you next. Julie is from the Ministry of Education, and she has signed up to support the Enabling Good Lives approach. Going forward, what does this mean for educators in classrooms and early childhood centres across Aotearoa? And there are 2 aspects to this that we'd like you to touch on, Julie. Firstly, what is the Ministry's of Education's long-term vision for the application of EGL? And 2, in practice, how can educators go about using the EGL approach? What would you see would be required of them?
Thank you. And again, big questions, and I'll give it my best shot, but happy to take some further questions. Kia ora koutou, I'm Julie Cook from the Ministry of Education. I'm currently working in the curriculum team, a new role which is about a refresh of the New Zealand curriculum, ensuring that there is a strong focus around a bicultural and inclusive framework that will weave itself through that, the curriculum refresh. But I think what's important is to just let you know my background over the past 3 or 4 years and experience around Enabling Good Lives. I had the opportunity end of 2017 to have a dedicated role with the Ministry of Education that was supporting how education was interfacing with mana whaikaha. And Shane mentioned that as the prototype of Enabling Good Lives, or the disability system transformation in the mid-central area. And that certainly allowed me to develop a deep understanding around Enabling Good Lives, the principles, and also what that looked like in an education setting. From there, I went through to the Ministry of Health and had a role as program lead with the disability system transformation work. So worked really closely with the National EGL Leadership Group and all the sites, the 3 sites, in looking at progressing, I guess, the transformation of the disability system, but importantly looking at an Enabling Good Lives approach and how that can be scaled across New Zealand. So bringing it back to your question, I just want to pick up a couple of things from Shane and the point he made around the principles and the approach, and the importance of seeing that it's not about waiting for something to be rolled out, but those principles, and what if you've had a chance to engage with them, are principles that would resonate really with any person in terms of what you would be expecting from a good life for any person, for a young person. From an education point of view, I think where we are, and I'm going to be quite frank here, I don't think we have across the Ministry of Education a wide understanding around, or even awareness perhaps, of Enabling Good Lives and the principles. I think there is, it could be from a learning support perspective, it may be wider known. But I think the opportunity we have is to take a wider systems perspective, because when we look at those principles, and I won't bore you with going into the NELP or the National Education and Learning Priorities, but if you were to go to that site, you will see language such as inclusive, you'll see language such as having high aspirations for every learner, you'll see language such as reducing barriers to education with a focus around disabled learners, and you'll see language around ensuring that the skills are for everybody around pathways to succeed in work. So when we talk about the ministry's vision or perspective around enabling good lives, I think what we have the opportunity to do is to draw some much more explicit alignment from the ministry's direction and I guess objectives and our overall vision to enabling good lives, because there is a risk if we don't do that, it can always be seen as sitting outside. And we know that it's not, when we talk about a good life for everybody, we talk about the principles, it's not something that just sits within the learning support group within the Ministry of Education. It is something that needs to go right across the board. And coming down to the curriculum work that we're undertaking at the moment, we talk about inclusive curriculum, we talk about an inclusive education system, but we know that there are many, many, many young people in our system who are excluded from education, who aren't really fully engaged in a curriculum that meets their needs. And we have, in some instances, a twin track approach where we have young people engaging in like additional curriculum or alternate curriculum. Where we really have that opportunity through the curriculum refresh is when we think about a curriculum, an inclusive curriculum, it's about a curriculum that fits the needs of young people, not the other way around. And that is a really, really significant shift, an important shift that where teachers will and schools will really be needing to be supported through, I guess, the work that will happen with the curriculum refresh to look at what does that actually mean? How do I think about planning for all young people in my classroom from the outset? And this comes down to the question around what does that look like in the classroom? I think if let's put the resources and funding aside and all else, if we look at an enabling good lives approach, if we look at the vision and the principles, it really has a strong values base. It has a strong base around changing attitudes and expectations. And I think if nothing else for teachers, to be really starting to think about what do those principles mean and look like in my class? How do you start to shift the expectations that are quite often limiting for young people because people focus on their disability or can come from a deficit language, a deficit perspective. But if we really try and look at the uniqueness of every learner and think about those principles about having voice, being person-centred, and that's really about that young person at the centre, that is a really important, I guess, shift. So from an attitudinal point of view, from an expectations point of view, because their pathways for young people are quite often predetermined by historical pathways. For example, young people with disabilities quite often go down the pathway after school into day services, residential, where they're thinking about opportunities that would be open to all young people leaving school in terms of further training, access to employment, may not be even in a school or even a family's perspective. So it's really starting to think from a very early age, what are the aspirations? How do we think about a good life plan early on and think about what are the aspirations for that young person? What are the aspirations for that family? And not set the limits on this is how we usually do it. But the question is, how do we then support and enable that to happen? And quite often that means agencies having to come around the table together and leave their respective, criteria at the door, to go and have that young person at the centre to actually be innovative around some of the supports. And that is challenging, but it's also at the core of really that successful good life planning and giving young people the best opportunity to move beyond some of that deficit language and thinking. So in summary, I think for classroom teachers, it's really starting to think about all learners from the start, thinking about what the aspirations and the strengths that young people bring, think about the supports that are going to be needed, and also that focus around good life planning and from a young person's aspiration from as early as possible starts to create pathways that may not have even been dreamed of by families a number of years ago. So I know that could sound quite high level, but sometimes it's starting with one family, one young person to start creating some of those differences and dreams.
Thank you very much, Julie. It's really heartening to hear you talk about how this isn't just about the learning support space, but this is about the whole space of education. So that's really critical, and it's great to hear your vision around that. Look, I want, if I may, just to tease out a little bit here, because we have heard from Shane that EGL is also associated with funding models. And in education, we know that there are about 1.3% of students who are disabled who currently receive higher levels of support that are funded. But we also know there are a significant portion of students who don't, with disabilities, who don't receive any particular funding. Are you able to explain very briefly how you would see the EGL approach being able to be used in a practical sense for potentially students who don't currently qualify for funding under the learning support?
I can. And again, I'm not a funding specialist, and but I think one of the opportunities, and again, it comes down to thinking about that young person from the outset in terms of what is it that's really important for them in their life. What's their goal? What are the goals that they have? Because quite often we start with the young person, their disability, and the funding, and sometimes the aspirations get lost because that becomes a particular focus. Just some of the experience that I've had in Manawhai Kaha, where there hasn't been, say, funding attached to a young person because they're not receiving ORS, for example. Where it has been successful is where some of the, and without getting into all the intricacies around staffing, but part of that Enabling Good Lives approach across the three sites that we have, there are dedicated roles that are called connectors. And so the work we did in Manawhai Kaha, and particularly in the Mid-Central and working with the Ministry of Education, was trying to develop a stronger partnership between the connectors, the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education. So there became a bit more of a team approach around identifying a particular plan, and then from each agency trying to look at what can happen then to support that young person. So instead of, so it wasn't about pooling funding, it was about how do you use some of that resourcing differently, and particularly working alongside the school and the young people who might have been excluded from school, looking at extra funding that might have gone into that young person, but that would be complemented by funding from Manawhai Kaha, because that young person was entitled to funding through their personal budget. So, I mean, that's probably a very long-winded response, but I think the starting point is really thinking about what is it that that young person needs to be successful, and then looking at how do we perhaps draw together what are the resources and supports that can enable that to happen. I said, I'm not an expert in funding, but I think it's for me, it's around starting with that young person and thinking about what are the aspirations and what does that good life plan focus on.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that, Julie. Look, just I want to pop in a little reminder here to all of our people viewing tonight. You are able to ask questions, and you can do so by using the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And those questions will then be fed through later in the webinar. We'll try and get to as many of those as we can. So please do start loading up your questions at any stage. Right, Freyan, we're going to come to you now. We'd like to ask you, what is your own experience of enabling good lives, and how can whānau go about accessing, using and improving their EGL experience? And perhaps if you could touch on also, what are some of the barriers to parents and whānau being able to access an EGL approach?
Thank you, Margie. Kia ora koutou. So I am a parent. I have 3 children, 2 disabled, 1 neurodiverse child. And my, I guess, understanding of EGL started quite a few years ago, Margie. My oldest son is 16 now. He attends a special school. And when he was about 2.5 years ago, I attended some really fantastic visioning and path planning workshops for disabled people and their families. And this was run by Imagine Better. And I had the opportunity, and I always think I'm really fortunate to have that experience, to meet parents who had, children in their teens, 20s, 30s, who were planning a good life for their children. And they wanted a mainstream life. They wanted things that their children were interested in, and, giving them that opportunity and moving away from the typical segregated, funded sort of living in a home with other disabled people model. And so I was really inspired and was really fortunate to have that opportunity early on in my life. So that shaped a lot of my thinking with regards to what I wanted for my son, who is disabled. And my second one, helped again, once we diagnosed him with the global developmental delay and stuff like that. So I've always had this vision of a good life for my children and making sure that they had access to mainstream education, participation in the community, and connections and relationships. So that's what has always driven me. So we started with that, and this was before the EGL principles as such had come out. So it was more about the approach, the visioning, understanding. And so that drove us towards making sure, we had a mainstream education. We managed that for all 3 kids. My oldest one, we managed until he was in intermediate, and we were literally, after 6 months of battling and struggling, asked to leave. And so for me, what the EGL principles signify, it signifies an opportunity for disabled people and their families to have that self-determination, the ability to choose and have genuine choices, not being forced into segregated settings, not being forced into limited choices, so that's really, really key. I am hoping that having the principles embedded in the education space will allow teachers and schools and professionals and educators, boards of trustees, the opportunity to really understand the disabled students and their families and work with them. So we've found it very difficult. We've had some success over the years, and we've had some absolute utter disasters and failures when we've tried to collaborate and work with, educators and professionals and schools. So I think I'm hopeful that with the principles being embedded into the education space, it'll become easier for families. Now, for me, frankly, it's a little too late. My, oldest is 16, my second one is 14. And sadly, even though my second one goes to a mainstream college, we can't get him to participate within the mainstream classes. He's segregated in a learning support unit. So it's slow because that understanding is not there. The understanding that disabled people may want ordinary life outcomes or may wish to choose mainstream first is not yet there in the education space. And I'm hoping that that's what will shift and change the attitudes. So the biggest barrier we've faced as a parent and a family supporting, disabled children is the attitudes. That's the biggest barrier we've faced. Resourcing, yes, from time to time, there's some barriers around the resourcing and supports, but we've always managed to, I guess, address those and overcome those. When there's collaboration, when there's that good relationship between home and school, and we've had some really fantastic relationship at times, it works really well. We know we can come up with those creative, collaborative solutions that work for our children. But when that relationship isn't there, it doesn't work. So I think the principle around relationship building, self-determination, mainstream first, those are absolutely key and critical. It's something we've lived with throughout our lives, and we would love to see them embedded in the education space so that parents, families, disabled students can be heard, can be understood, and their dreams and aspirations really, recognized and upheld. So that's in the education space, but then also thinking wider, Maggie, it's been a challenge within the community. So even little things like, after school classes that most children would attend. I remember when my son was in primary, things like, holiday soccer programs, or, they would have some sort of, after school dance or drama classes. Getting him to participate in those was a challenge. Often it would be, there would be an implied sort of, rejection, inquiring if we had considered a special group, some special classes and stuff like that. So I think that's also been a struggle, and I would love to, moving on, ahead in the future, see more inclusion happening in those mainstream spaces. And I think that only happens when you have the community, wider community, sort of really understanding what the EGL principles are, because then we can actually use the EGL principles to shift attitudes. And then you can have the EGL approach, which actually allows for that collaboration and creative thinking to build a good life for our children. So years ago, I participated in some of the interviews that were done around the A Good Start in Life report. And it was really, it was heartbreaking sitting there and talking about, everything you wanted for your children, all the aspirations, and then seeing all the barriers. And it also gave us, I guess, the determination and courage to keep going and moving forward with those principles, so to speak. So as a family, Margie, we've always lived those principles. It's been very hard at times, but for us, these are really important principles, and so we've lived by them. And we would love to see others we engage with really understand those principles and live by them as well, because that would make our life a lot easier. And for our children, I think it will allow them to not only have their aspirations, their interests, their strengths recognized and sort of be encouraged, but it will give them an opportunity to participate and be part of their local community. And that's been really important for us. It's important for a lot of reasons. A sense of belonging is something that everybody needs, as people, we are communal and social beings. And so it's important that we and our children can have that sense of belonging. But also, when you look at the statistics around isolation, mental health, abuse for disabled people as they grow older, those statistics are horrendous. If they are part of that community and they have connections and relationships in the community, there are some safeguards for them. So I think looking at the future long term, that's why we think it's really, really important, although we've missed the boat with, the EGL principles in the education space. It's really important that we work towards this and that everybody comes together to make it happen in the education space. If children who attend school with my children are able to accept them, value them, they are then going to move on to the wider community and have jobs as employers, principals, teachers, all sorts of positions in society, and hopefully that generation will then be able to become more inclusive, more accepting, and more respectful of our disabled children's needs, challenges, and aspirations. So
thank you so
fingers
much.
Crossed.
Thank you so much, Freyan. It's really refreshing that you've come to represent not only your knowledge from within the education sector as an educator yourself, but the wider aspirations and dreams of parents of disabled students and of the disabled young people themselves. So thank you so much for speaking with passion and the commitment that you continue to show in this space. So moving on now, Sonia, we'd like to come to you now. You've been working with mana whaikaha in Manawatu and using the Enabling Good Lives approach at Awatapu College. As an educator, what have been your observations using this approach, and how could other educators go about using EGL themselves?
Good evening. So I'm an occupational therapist first and a teacher second, and I've been teaching at Awatapu College for about 15 years, the last 2 as the head of department in our special needs unit there. I thought I'll give you a little bit of background about the school and where we sit. So we're a mainstream school and we have a unit of about 50 Oars funded students within that mainstream setting. We've got a few students who are not Oars funded, who we look after as well. And I have to say that mana whakaiha, one of the earlier questions, mana whakaiha have funded specialist support for some of those students who don't meet the Oars criteria. So that's something that they have helped out with, which has been really good. We've got 6 classes and 5 teachers plus myself, as well as 18 support staff. And we're growing. We've got lots of enrolments for next year. So we do have quite a big group that we look after. We've been working with mana whakaiha since its inception. We were lucky that 3 of our families, when it all began, 3 of our families were part of the parent group to get it started. So we were very fortunate to have a bit of the inside running on what it was all about, and went along to lots of meetings in the community, and we also had meetings at school with the mana whakaiha and Enabling Good Lives team coming to talk to the staff and also coming to talk to our families to try and explain what it was all about and what the different approach might look like. So that was quite challenging, maybe for the presenters as well as for the families at times. But slowly I can see our families are understanding how to put themselves first. So that's something that they're not used to doing, and it's been a struggle for a few families to be able to think of what aspirations they might have for their children, because they're very used to being told how it's going to be rather than them thinking how it could be. So that's been a really nice mind shift for our families. So we embraced the EGL vision and principles. We did find that we felt that we used these in our everyday school life anyhow, so it wasn't a big change for us. It was just using some different language and encouraging our families to get on board and to work with a new structure that they were unfamiliar with. So the relationship building is really important. That has been critical, working with mana whakaiha, working with the families and our specialists to all come together to generate what a good life looks like for our students. So one of the examples I thought I'd give you of how we use the principles, the ordinary life outcomes. Our school is it's the core goal really for all of our students that come to our unit, is that we want them to have a great life when they leave us. We're only just a little blip on their life horizon, and it all happens after we're gone. So we're trying to set them up to have the best experiences, to be best prepared for a great life when they leave college. One of the things that we've done is we have this year a life tasting sports program, and the philosophy behind that was a lot of our students have a natural no. If you ask them, would you like to do this? Would you like to do that? It's no. And that's mostly because they've got no idea what we're talking about. And so our plan was to offer a range of different experiences, often enough for them to understand what that looked like, so that they could then make an informed choice about whether or not that's something that they enjoy, whether they like doing it, whether they want to carry on, and then how we can support them to continue that outside of school. So we've done all kinds of different things. We've done skateboarding and gymnastics and bowling and swimming lessons, Zumba. Zumba's very popular. We've done golf, spin class. We've tried to find activities that are local to our community, so that they're easy for our students to access outside of school. Transport is often an issue, so we want it to be as inclusive as possible. We have had one student build his own golf course on his farm after we did golf, so that was pretty cool. Some have joined up with Special Olympics programs, so that's great too. And, we're encouraging our families to use their mana whakaiha funding to have buddies, work with the students to take them to some of these activities if they are wanting to continue them outside of school and the families can't do it themselves. So we really want to see it through, not just give them a tasting opportunity and then just leave it at that. We want to take the next step, always take the next step and see where that can progress into the community. We're a fund holder school, so we have specialists work in our unit, and at the moment we're using one of our occupational therapists to work with the transition programs. And our goal really is to make sure that they are really meaningful and purposeful for the students. So she's looking at doing some good interviewing and observations and working with the students so that she gets an idea of what the students are good at, what they'd like to do, and then we can channel and be more targeted with our work experience options. So we have a few different things that we've been doing there. We've community cafe visits, school dances prior to the school ball. So we have a little practice run, which unfortunately has been postponed because it was supposed to be next weekend. So that's a bit sad. We've got Lego social skills therapy program and our work experience. So we've got students in a range of work experience programs. We like to start with in-school work experience and then build to group work experience that are maybe simpler tasks, and then looking at ultimately having targeted one, single work experience options. So we've got some students at childcare centres, one student who works up at Ag Research as a lab technician. We have students, another student who's working with Guardian Tree Services, and so he's outdoors and doing horticultural stuff. And health food shop. And so, really the goal is to try to have our students all placed somewhere that's meaningful for them. Not us saying, well, we've got these placements and you should fit into one of those. We want to flip that around, which is part of the EGL concept, and find a placement that's right for the student.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to hear the wide range of ways you are thinking about EGL in your setting, and to hear the practical things that are happening and the experiences that the young people are able to access because of the way you are using this approach in your school. Look, we are going to move on now into opening up the Q&A session, and just to get things started this evening, I'm going to start with a question that is open to anybody on the panel to pop in a response to. So this question is, how might the self-governing nature of schools, so the fact that they are their own entities controlled by their own board of trustees, how might this impact on a school's ability to apply the EGL principles, and how might consistency and equity of access and practice be assured across the education sector for all disabled children and their whānau? I wonder whether perhaps we go to Julie first.
Yes, Kira, happy to respond to that. That is a really great question. I think there are a couple of practical things that have been talked about, but I don't think we've really got off the ground, and that's about the Board of Trustees and the opportunity for some really good, clear information about enabling good lives that can be developed for boards of trustees. I know in Mana Whaikaha, one of the projects that we had started was with the community to develop some, some professional development, but some information for local boards. But I think that becomes a really good starting point, because and I don't believe that would be really difficult to do. And that starts to really put the principles in front of schools and in front of boards to be able to ask, well, what could this look like in our particular school? What would be some of the things that this principle that we're already doing? Because we're not talking about something that would be brand new, or schools would have to do something different, because I'm sure that a lot of schools would be able to see that we're already doing this, but we can strengthen that approach. So firstly, I think having some really clear information for boards, and hopefully, and also to do it in a practical way, and whether that's supported by regions or by local communities, but certainly going to Freon's point around that local community around the school. And opportunities for maybe parents who have a young child with a disability to be part of some of that information that's shared with that school. At a wider approach around that whole strategic, I think it goes back to my initial point, is that I don't think from a Ministry of Education there is a widely enough awareness even, let alone understanding around the principles of enabling good lives. I think that becomes a really important starting point from a system point of view, because they would fit very neatly underneath existing high-level objectives and outcomes, but provide a way to say the enabling good lives are appropriate and relevant at that wider system level. So I think there could be some really dedicated work from a system level to really look at how do those principles align and what does that look like. And then I think it's coming down to the work that might be happening, and I'm talking from a curriculum point of view, if we're thinking about key principles that will be reflected within the refresh of the New Zealand curriculum, how do you have some more explicitness that you would see the Enabling Good Lives vision and principles present or represented in some way with some of that content as well? So, there's some longer term things that need to happen. But I think from the Board of Studies from local schools, if we can start to look at some consistent information around enabling good lives from an education point of view, and ask the question, what does this look like, or what could this look like in our school? What are some of the shifts that we're needing to make? And then from a classroom, what would this look like for me as a classroom teacher? And how do schools support teachers in that space?
Thank you.
Just quickly jump in, Margie.
Yes.
At a more practical level for parents and families, I think it's important that not only are you yourself aware of EGL principles and what it means to you as a family, but also making sure that you share that with the wider community, the school community. And one really easy way is to actually just email your school board and say, look, are you aware of EGL principles? Within your inclusion policy, is that a framework that you could clearly recognize and give some regard to? So that, the interactions that our families have with the school and school professionals are, have the principles, EGL principles embedded within that. So I think it's important to start having those conversations. IEP meetings are fantastic. Talk about EGL principles when you're sharing your vision, talk about what's important, which this happens to be really important, and this aligns with the EGL principle of self-determination or mainstream first. Talk about it in your conversations, and write to your school boards as well in terms of getting them more aware of it. So yeah.
Thank you.
And also request to have your connector at your IEP meetings, because that's really invaluable if they can be present.
Sure. Can I just take a moment then just to explain for people listening in tonight, under the EGL funding model, please correct me, any of the panellists, if I get this slightly wrong. Under the funding model that disabled people are able to access funding allocated to them under EGL, that process comes with a connector, which is a person that assists that young person to find and express what their aspirations are, and then to find practical ways to be able to put those aspirations into place. So they're kind of like a person that walks along on that journey with that young person and is able to advocate for them. Would that be correct summation, Shane?
Yes. Most important thing, they're not a support person, because it's got a little bit lost in the past. To Whanau, it's not a support person. It's just someone to help dream, aspiration, whatever you want to call it, not a support person.
Yeah,
facilitate.
Not a carer in that sort of older sense, but there's somebody to really help that person find what it is they want to achieve, and then help facilitate that.
And just a quick point around that. There's currently work underway, and this is through the Ministry of Health, who are leading that work, which is about really scaling up an Enabling Good Lives approach beyond the current 3 sites.
Oh, yes, we're very excited.
And that's really about really taking the Ministry of Health away from being the main deliverer or being a service driven. And we know that connectors are a really important part of that approach. So there's currently, and Shane, you're probably more aware of that now than me now, but that's certainly a really key direction that has been supported by ministers, and also I think, across agency as well.
So we've only really got 5 minutes of scheduled time left for this. So I'm very conscious of the time because there are some wonderful questions that have still popped up. Look, I'm going to move to one at the moment that, Shane, I'd like to address to you. It says, whānau love and accept their tamariki just as they are. Principles and values are within every whānau. Why do you think perhaps that principles and values are not always practiced within the education system in the way that they are within whānau? So perhaps I'll just summarise that again. The central to all whānau is just a love for their tamariki, regardless of any disability. Sometimes the experience within education can be a little bit different. Why do you think that might be?
I guess the schools, the educators are focusing on the, 30 students, 20 students at a time and not focusing on the individual. So how I've normally found when I've gone to a country schools, it's normally you're getting that relationship with the teachers, and because generally the classes are a lot smaller. But when you go to a bigger school, it's a lot harder.
I think that's a really valid point that you raise that I think is probably in a lot of educators' minds and a lot of families' minds as well. Yeah. Look, there are so many good questions here, and I'm going to try and sort of skip through to some that kind of stand out. There's another standout one here, and perhaps, Sonia, you might want to address this in the first instance. For students with limited language skills, how would EGL ensure that their voice is captured and their educational aspirations are able to be heard?
So obviously the family is central to our students who have limited communication skills. I just want to say to all of you families out there, please engage with your schools, because it is so hard for the schools to help your students and to get on that journey with you if you don't talk to us and if you don't say anything. So I think that this is where the longevity of EGL and those principles is going to show in the years to come. So, like I said before, some of our families are still learning about how to create those visions and be part of that process. And so for us, we're helping them to do that. It's all about communication for our students who have limited communication skills. It's all about communication with the families and knowing the students really well to advocate for them.
Thank you.
Can I quickly?
Yes.
So when you look at the Enabling Good Lives principles and then you look at the youth strategy, they're very much the same sort of thing. So we're not inventing something new.
That's probably a really, really valid point for us all to really think about and think about how that impacts the way we are working within our education sector. Thank you. Perhaps we'll wind up with this last question here, and there are so many good questions, so I do apologise to all our participants who have been putting up some fabulous questions, and I hope we get an opportunity in the future to be able to have some of these addressed. But perhaps if we could wind up with, as we move toward taking an EGL approach in education, are there any structural barriers that currently exist to doing this? For example, clashes with existing legislations or funding mechanisms. And perhaps if we could just go around each of the participants and see what your perspective is around that question. Should we start with you, Sonia?
I'm not sure, actually. I don't know the answer to that question. Certainly for us at our school, the biggest barriers have been people's own mindset and I guess just being creative in how to approach what families are needing for their kids. So we're pretty creative and a bit ballsy. So I think if you had people in your school who maybe were a bit scared to step outside the box, then that could be a barrier.
Thank you. Can you, Sonia, just clarify for us, in your college, is the EGL being used specifically just within the learning support class, or is it out amongst the mainstream classrooms being utilised with any disabled students, whether they qualify for funding or not?
Certainly it's used within the unit, which is mostly Oars funded students, but our learning support department who help the students who are not Oars funded but still have additional needs, she's very aware of the Enabling Good Lives as well, and so she helps to use it. In terms of the wider school, probably not so much. In the language of EGL, it might be there embedded in various aspects or departments, but not so much in the language of EGL. They probably don't know they're doing it, really. Yeah.
Okay. Priya, do you have any comments to add?
Sure. Margie, the biggest barrier, systemic barrier as such, is a lack of commitment towards the EGL principles at a much higher level. So I'm talking at ministerial level and also at sector levels. So it's really important that we get that commitment from ministers and the different sectors, education, health, social services. We've got to have that collaboration happening at that level, talks happening at that level, and a very serious commitment to it. And the next level down then, I guess, is making sure it flows through the different, layers so that the principles are embedded within the classroom. And it's important that everybody, and that's why I always go back to the different levels of the system within the school as well. It's not just the teachers, it is the teachers, the leadership team, SEMCO, principal, boards, who have to be made aware. So I think that commitment has to come from higher up. Otherwise, it will just remain on paper, unfortunately. We've seen that happen with the Section 33 and 34 of the Education and Training Act. It's there on paper, but in reality, we do not have it. Our children do not have those opportunities to attend their mainstream schools or to attend them for a full day. Same with the Article 24 of the UNCRPD talks about inclusive education and accommodation, adaptation for those who need it. And it's there on paper. It does not always have in practice. So I think that's a huge one. The government needs to make that commitment, and it needs to make that commitment across the sectors, not just within the disability sector alone. So that's a huge one to get it going within education space. That's just my little bit.
Well, I think that flows on nicely to the fact that we do have Julie here with us tonight, who's spoken so well and with such commitment, showing such commitment to the EGL approach. Julie, would you like to just offer any last very brief words around what you see the immediate barriers that you would like to be addressing?
Kia ora. Thank you. I really want to pick up both Priyana and Sonia's. I don't think the barriers are structural. I don't think the barriers at this stage are financial. I think they are a lack of awareness and understanding around enabling good lives from a wider education system point of view, and what are the implications, and how do we enact those principles within our education system at a higher level but down into the classroom. And I also think the significant barrier is an attitudinal barrier, which is about also expectations. And I think that's a wider community barrier that, our schools are sometimes a reflection of wider community. And if anybody has read, just really quickly, there's a really cool podcast series called What's Wrong With You by Olivia Shivers and Rebecca Dubber. It's in today's Stuff. They're doing it as a stuff. They're talking about experience in schools from a disability, and it really captures just some of the conversation we've been having around attitudes being a significant barrier that don't require lots and lots of funding. It's about thinking differently in that space. So.
Thank you. Shane, I'd like to give you the last word. Come back to you because we started with you tonight. From your lived experience, what would you like all of us to take away tonight and remember and act on every day?
Oh, wow. That's a
Go Shane.
it's a big one to finish on. Well, just to, if you, as I said before, enabling good lives, we're not thinking of something new. It's just the same as most things nowadays. It's the rights of persons of disability strategy, it's the youth strategy. So we're not inventing something new. And and as touched on with the ministers are very interested. Pene Henare, we've met with him. He's very, very interested. Minister Whanau, so various ministers are engaging around the table, but can't say too much right now. We'll have to wait for the announcement.
I guess what I'm hearing from you, Shane, is that none of this is new. So I guess, I take from that there's a challenge for all of us to stop talking about things and to actually find very practical and useful ways to put things into action every day and in every space with every child who has a disability.
Yes.
Okay, look, unfortunately, we are now at the end of our webinar, so we will need to wrap up here, and I do apologise because we have gone a little over, so thank you to those of you who stayed with us right to the very end. I will now close with a karakia. Kia tau te rangamari e, o te rangi nui e tā iho nei, o papatua nuku e tākoto nei, o te tai ao e awhi nei, ki ronga i a tātou, Tihei Mauri ora. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Go well.
Kia ora.